We now move to First Minister's questions. Question number 1, Joanne Lamont.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what engagements he has planned for the rest of the day.
First Minister.
Engagements to take forward the Government's programme for Scotland. In particular, I will be writing again to the Prime Minister in the light of the GDP recessionary statistics published yesterday for the UK, stressing the importance of going ahead with the shovel-ready programme of projects from the north of Scotland to the south west of Scotland to stimulate the Scottish economy and nourish the hopes of keeping Scotland out of recession.
Joanne Lamont.
Well, yes, of course, but we would have welcomed if the First Minister had used the investment in Forth Road Bridge to create jobs in Scotland rather than jobs in China. After days of, some might say, uncharacteristic silence and perhaps a little more common prevarication and bluster, the First Minister last night finally alighted on a defence of his position to support Rupert Murdoch's bid to take over BSkyB. It is, he says, because it would have created jobs in Scotland. Can the First Minister tell us when he first articulated this view in public and how many jobs did James Murdoch promise him?
First Minister.
Well, the importance of the issue was first discussed, as we know from the emails released on the 1st of November 2010. The email which says that a Liberal MP, we now think it was a Liberal MSP, wanted to take forward the importance of jobs and investment in Scotland to the Secretary of State, and I very much agreed with that position. Then, of course, Joanne Lamont will remember the correspondence we released at the meeting I had with James Murdoch last January, a year past January, which looked in particular at the prospects of employment in Scotland, adding to the 6,300 jobs that BSkyB employ in Dunfermline, Uddingston and Livingston. She will, of course, recall the announcement of a further 100 jobs last March, which added to the Livingston total. But I hope that Joanne Lamont is also aware of the further significance to jobs in Scotland, because one of the issues that was being discussed last year was that BSkyB were moving from 9 contractors to 2 contractors, and that carried with it the risk, for security reasons, but carried with the risk of major job losses in Scotland unless Scotland won the contracts. I'm delighted to say, of course, that Hero TSC did win the major contract, leading to this last week's announcement, and I'll quote it to Joanne Lamont: Glasgow's newest employers today officially opened their state-of-the-art contact centre in the city and vowed to bring 900 jobs to the Atlantic Quay site. Hero TSC's leading management company announced last month they were coming to Glasgow after expanding their contact centre to provide sales and support service to BSkyB. I hope at least Joanne Lamont will welcome these huge number of jobs coming to the city of Glasgow.
Joanne Lamont.
I always welcome jobs coming to my own city. I also welcome when the First Minister answers the question he was asked. And I wait for that day to happen. Perhaps it may happen at some point in the future. Because, of course, the reason he can't tell us when the first time he articulated this view in public was because the first time he did articulate that view in public was last night. And it was less of a reason, more of an alibi. And while the First Minister claims this was about gaining jobs, Rupert Murdoch says he spoke to the First Minister to apologise for cutting jobs. But, of course, not everyone agreed with what the First Minister now says, that this deal would be good for Scotland. I have here a motion to the Scottish Parliament from October 2010, signed by the constituency MSP for BSkyB's biggest Scottish base, Angela Constance, now the First Minister's Employment Minister, a motion which imposes the News International deal. Yet SNP policy, we seem to appear, had changed by 1st of November, because we know that from Frederick Michel's emails that it was mission accomplished, and the First Minister was prepared to lobby Vince Cable on Murdoch's behalf. We know this was still the position in February and in March, and that Alex Salmond had a call scheduled with the new Culture Secretary, Jeremy Hunt. Yet on July 13th last year, all 6 of Alex Salmond's MPs at Westminster supported a motion asking Rupert Murdoch to withdraw the bid for BSkyB. So if this was really such a good job for Scotland, as the First Minister said last night, that jobs relied on it, why did the First Minister support his own MPs in opposing the deal?
First Minister.
Because that was after
Order,
the
we will hear the
revelation.
First Minister.
Because that was after the revelations of phone hacking and Millie Dowler. And I thought that is patently obvious. Now, the interesting thing about Jan Lamont is, I can understand her perhaps not being fully aware of the importance of jobs in Uddingston and Dunfermline and Livingston. But why on earth is she not aware of the importance of jobs in the city of Glasgow? What Rupert Murdoch was referring to in the evidence yesterday was exactly the point that my first answer alluded to, and that is the fact that the Sky contract was going from 9 centres to 2 centres. That carried with it the huge risk last year of losing thousands of Scottish jobs. Fortunately, Hero TSC won the contract, leading to the opening of the call centre and supply centre in Glasgow. 900 jobs to the Atlantic Quay site. Now, Jan Lamont may not be aware of it, but I know Sandra White is, because it's in her constituency. I know her deputy, Anna Sarwar, whose constituency in, presumably is aware of 900 jobs coming to his constituency. Now, as Jan Lamont says, we have not talked about this, we published correspondence with the James Murdoch months ago, which showed that the meeting in London concerned the protection and the expansion of jobs in Dunfermline and Livingston. Jan Lamont may not think these things are important. I think it's the job of a First Minister to advocate jobs for Scotland, and I'll continue to do so.
Joanne Lamont. We will hear Miss Lamont. Joanne Lamont.
I don't think the First Minister listened to what I said. His own Employment Minister, representing Livingston, opposed the deal. His own MPs opposed the deal. I welcome jobs coming to Glasgow, but they've got nothing to do with this issue of News International. And the First Minister says that the reason the position changed was because of Millie Dowler. Well, the revelation that Rupert Murdoch's newspaper hacked Millie Dowler's phone was the moment that any doubt about Rupert Murdoch was removed. It was the moment his empire started to fall. And yet, after that devastating revelation, the First Minister became the only senior politician in this country, perhaps the only one in the world, to invite him round for tea. His newspapers might be being investigated for bribery, perverting the course of justice, destroying evidence and perjury, but Rupert's still welcome in Wee X House, and he writes an article in the launch of his newspaper saying it wasn't just News International, it's all of the newspaper industry. So there may be 3 police investigations going on, and a judicial inquiry, and nearly 50 arrests, but X still puts a kettle on for Rupert. Doesn't the First Minister realise that all he is achieving is to demean the office he craved for so long?
First Minister.
Yes, I remember writing the article in the Sun on Sunday. It was followed the next week by Yvette Cooper, who wrote a very interesting article indeed. But I know that the Labour Party would wish us to pretend that the days of courting the Murdoch press were all back in the days of Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. Unfortunately, it doesn't fit with the facts. William Shawcross, who's Rupert Murdoch's biographer, writing in The Spectator the 16th of July, quote, Ed Miliband was beaming when I saw him talking to Rupert Murdoch at the media magnate's summer party at the Orangery in Kensington Palace just 3 weeks ago. The Labour leader has since admitted he did not raise the matter of phone hacking that evening. Of course not. He was trying to charm. It's rather like this picture of Ed Miliband. advocating the Sun, advocating and looking for support from the Sun, declaring Red Ed is dead. I will stand, and my party will stand from the mainstream of Britain for Sun readers and their concerns. He refused to put a date when a new set of policies will be ready. He says you'll read about it first in the Sun. So I think this 15 years of worshipping at the feet of Rupert Murdoch from the Labour Party, now treating him as a pariah, refusing to explain the canopies of the energy, refusing to explain the contacts over the period.
I would like to hear the First Minister.
What people in Scotland will see when they see Joanne Lamont and the Labour Party's words and they'll think of humbug and hypocrisy.
Joanne Lamont.
I hate to think what they'll think of that performance. And I say on the question of Ed Miliband, as I remind him again, Ed Miliband put down a motion opposing the deal. The First Minister's own MPs also supported that deal. Now, I'm not going to ask the First Minister if he supported Murdoch so that Murdoch's son supported him. The public will have made up their own minds on that. But isn't the truth, this is not about the First Minister's evident cynicism, which we've seen in the past, but his infatuation with very rich men. First, he gave his office full backing to the then Sir Fred Goodwin in the deal that broke the bank. Who can forget?
Order. We will hear Miss Lamont.
Yeah, I'm sure a lot of this in the backbench of the SNP comes as much of a revelation to them as it did to us. Who can forget, even without yesterday's reminder, the deal with Donald Trump, now Murdoch? Now, there are common themes here. Each case was secret, each deal was a fiasco, and in each case, the truth had to be dragged out of the First Minister, bit by bit. Big deals, big men, one not quite so big man. No jobs, just job losses. He says it's about jobs. I think he just likes rich men. Some say the First Minister has been devious, conniving, double-dealing. Isn't he just trying to cover up the fact that a rich man has played him for a fool again? Is it not the case that he's no statesman, just a sucker?
First Minister. First Minister.
The reference to job losses, of course, was a reference back to the first question and answer that Joanne Lamont didn't take in. The fear that there was going to be substantial job losses as a result of the contracts going from 9 to 2. I read out in extensive detail the fact that, thankfully, Hero TSC won the contract and a 900-job call centre has been opened in the city of Glasgow. Not just Joanne Lamont didn't know that the first question, she didn't realise I'd answered it for her second question, and she now repeats it in her pre-prepared fourth question. Now, talking about Fred Goodwin, that would be Sir Fred Goodwin, knighted by Gordon Brown on the advice of Jack McConnell. Donald Trump, up until this last Sunday, Donald Trump's argument to the Scottish Government is that we were bound by a deal that he claimed had been made between him and Lord McConnell in the previous administration. I really do think Joanne Lamont should understand and perhaps inform Lord McConnell and Donald Trump that we are not bound by the policies of the last administration, and thank goodness for that in Scotland. But I'll tell Joanne Lamont one thing that would be consistent with any First Minister of Scotland, and that is that they would put the interests of Scotland first and the interests of jobs first. Now, how do I know this? Well, Joanne Lamont was interviewed in Good Morning Scotland yesterday, and let me read out the exchange so as the Chamber understands it. Gary Robertson, would you, if you were First Minister, heaven forfend, that was the Gary Robertson, that was me. be meeting Rupert Murdoch and others to talk about jobs in Scotland. Joanne Lamont, well, you'd have to meet people to talk about jobs. And there we have it, the whole cant, humbug, hypocrisy. The job of a First Minister is to advocate jobs for Scotland. This First Minister will continue to do it.
Question number 2, Ruth Davidson. Ruth Davidson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister when he'll next meet the Secretary of State for Scotland.
First Minister.
No plans, immediate future.
Ruth Davidson.
Thank you. Well, while we're on the topic of New York-based billionaires, the First Minister was asked in January of 2008 by the Local Government and Communities Committee if he'd ever met, prior to the previous December, any members of the Trump Organisation. He replied that he had met representatives at the Many Estate on the 24th of September 2007. No mention of the Donald, no mention of candlelit Manhattan dinners, no mention of talking for hours on the favoured subjects of golf and wind farms. That dinner occurred just 3 months before that committee meeting. Did the First Minister intentionally mislead Parliament, or did he just forget, in the glory of supping with Murdoch one night, that he'd been supping with Trump the next?
First Minister.
I'm sorry to disabuse Ruth Davidson of the idea of a candlelit dinner between myself and Donald Trump. This was a global Scot dinner in New York. Attending the event were the Alexandra Real Estates, the General Electric, the head of Discovery Research of YF Research, McKinsey and Company, the Morgan Stanley Banking Corporation. I don't think it sounds the likely venue to be exchanging commitments in terms of a planning application 5 years down the road. Let me repeat, this government have never given any assurances against a planning application for offshore wind in Aberdeen. I cannot speak for the previous administration, but the most significant thing in terms of validating that position is as follows. In February of this year, I wrote to him afterwards, after receiving a number of letters from the Donald. I had a phone conversation with him, and I was trying to work out the nature of his ferocious opposition, not just apparently to offshore wind, offshore Aberdeen, but to wind power in general, which seemed to be a new phenomenon. And right through that phone call, he accepted that he'd never had any commitments from this administration, but he considered us bound by the commitment of the previous administration. An issue which was maintained and sustained by spokesman George Sorial right through last week in a BBC interview. And only on Sunday was it decided that a global Scot event attended by many others was the moment at which this commitment would be given. I think that's rather unlikely. I think for the first time in her life, Ruth Davidson has paid attention to the advice of Murdo Fraser. And if this is the best that Murdo Fraser can do, I suggest she gets a new adviser.
Ruth Davidson.
Well, if the First Minister has nothing to hide from a 12-man dinner, then why not tell the committee about it just 3 months later? The First Minister, in his overweening self-regard, never knowingly undersells what he thinks or believes to be his own political gifts. And I don't think even Mr Salmond himself thought that he had the skills to make Donald Trump look credible. We know that the dinner that Alex Salmond failed to disclose to the committee took place, and thank you for finally now admitting it. We know that he and Donald talked for hours. We know that they talked about golf. We know that they talked about wind farms. Is the First Minister seriously asking the Scottish people to believe that when a multi-billionaire, attracted to Scotland with great fanfare by his predecessor, was threatening to pull the plug as soon as he took office, that he didn't, like some latter-day Arthur Daly, tell his new best pal that he would get it sorted? Something here stinks, Presiding Officer. Will the First Minister set the record straight and state categorically before this chamber that no such discussions on the planning or on the wind farms took place?
First Minister.
No discussion, no assurances were ever given in that light. But I think Ruth Davidson better get the timeline right. The Donald hasn't been threatening to pull out of the Benny estate until the last few months. and there's been a variety of reasons given for not his decision to pull out of the golf course, incidentally, development, which by all accounts looks absolutely wonderful. But first of all, it was Michael Forbes' Croft, which was the reason for not having the hotel development. It's only very recently that we've alighted on his opposition to the government's policy of renewable energy. And if she cares to check the record, that wasn't even the position of the Trump organisation in a letter they wrote just a year or so ago. But I was very struck by this thing about credible. Now, I have to confess, I only saw the excerpts of the evidence session yesterday. But I was struck by the question when Donald Trump was asked, what is the evidence for this great difficulty in Scottish tourism? And he says, I am the evidence. And I have to say, it struck me not so much as credible, a bit like the Judge Dredd view of tourism in Scotland. I think people in Scotland, when they look at this issue, will look at jobs and development. They'll see the announcements today for the Moray Firth. They'll see the prospect of 28,000 jobs in offshore wind. And it will be a shame on the Conservative Party in Scotland that while their colleagues in London are supporting such developments, Ruth Davidson and her colleagues don't want to see these developments and these massive jobs in green energy in Scotland.
A supplementary question from Willie Rennie.
I hear what the First Minister says about Millie Dowler. So, does he regret that terrible article in The Sun, where he played down the role of Rupert Murdoch's papers in phone hacking? Is he ashamed that he put his political motives above those of the phone hacking victims?
First Minister.
Well, my opposition revulsion about phone hacking is well on the record many times. I can supply that to Spice. Of course, I supported the establishment of the Leveson inquiry. Indeed, we had to comment on the terms of reference of the Leveson inquiry. I think the deplorable aspect of whole phone hacking will be fully dealt with at the inquiry, and I hope fully dealt with by the police force and the judicial system on both sides of the border. But I have to say to Willie Rennie, if given the evidence that's coming before Leveson, and particularly the insight we had into it from ITN just a few weeks ago, of the extent of the payments made by a number of news organisations in terms of investigators for suspected breaches and criminality, I really think that one of the things I am certain is going to come out of the Leveson inquiry is there were widespread malpractice and widespread potential illegality across the press. That seems to me evident, and I hope and believe that the Leveson inquiry will pursue that without fear and without favour.
Question number 3, Patrick Harvey.
Can I ask the First Minister when a decision will be made on the European Offshore Wind Deployment Centre?
First Minister.
Well, as the responsible Minister, Fergus Ewing, Minister for Energy, Enterprise and Tourism, will make a decision on the European Offshore Wind Deployment Centre based on our planning legislation. He will do so once there has been a full and thorough consideration of all material issues connected with the application. And can I say that the fact that I am the constituency MSP means that I will not be determining that application, and all comments on the matter should be taken in that light.
Patrick Harvey.
Thank you. Now that my favourite pantomime villain has left the stage for now, I hope the First Minister is coming to regret having been drawn so easily into Mr Trump's orbit and finding himself now with a half-built carbuncle in his constituency and a billionaire threatening legal action against a vital demonstration site for offshore wind power. This Parliament has committed itself to fighting the climate change Trump doesn't believe in and securing a lower carbon energy supply Trump doesn't care about. Can we now rely on the Scottish Government and on the First Minister to treat the wind farm proposal with the seriousness it deserves, defend it vigorously in the courts if it comes to that, and take no delay in telling Mr Trump where to get off? Kicking him out of the Global Scot network would be a good start.
First Minister.
Well, I thought I'd hoped I was going to be able to agree with everything that Patrick Harvey was going to say in asking this question. So let me first start with a point of disagreement. By all accounts, by every account, the golf course which is emerging in the Many estate it looks absolutely tremendous, and I don't think that's a reasonable description to make of it. However, the point that I made to the Scottish Trade Union Congress this week is the one that pertains. We welcome investment in Scotland. It is absolutely vital to have investment across the range of technologies, of industries, and I think golf course investment is a very valid thing as well. The issue now, though, is not just investing in Scotland, but whether that confers ownership of Scotland. And just because somebody invests in a vital project doesn't give with it the right to say that everybody else's project cannot go ahead. Other people's projects, and that include, say, offshore demonstrator, need to be assessed in the proper manner, and I'm certain that the Minister of Energy will do that according to his duties and responsibilities. On the generality, then two things I would say. Anybody who doesn't know my position and advocacy of the potential and wealth of renewable energy in the marine sector in Scotland, hasn't been paying much attention to Scottish politics over these last few years. I think there is the most extraordinary potential to see the reindustrialisation of vast areas of this country around the ports of Scotland, the research and development, the engineering, the installation and the servicing of these new machines, which will power much of the next century, are an essential part of the future of this country.
Question number 4, Nigel Dawn.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what steps the Scottish Government is taking to address concerns raised by the STUC regarding youth unemployment.
First Minister.
Well, I was very pleased to address the STUC Congress in Inverness on Tuesday, and I set out to them what the Government has taken to support youth employment, work, of course, which in many cases have been supported by the Scottish Trade Union Congress. Angela Constance is the only youth employment minister in these islands, has set out in our draft youth employment strategy the all-government, all-Scotland approach, and it's gaining substantial support. This month we began the rollout of the Opportunities for All programme, which guarantees to every 16 to 19-year-old school leaver not already in work, education or training that they'll be offered a suitable training or educational opportunity. There are 25,000 modern apprenticeships. We now know reached over 26,000 in the last financial year, and best of all, the success rate, the completion rate for the apprenticeships reached a record 75%. So a huge amount requires to be done, but let's pay regard to the substantial amount that is being done.
Nigel Dawn.
First Minister for his response. I'm also conscious that the issue of female unemployment was one of the ones that was raised by the STUC, and I'm wondering whether the First Minister can give us some insight into what the Government is doing on that particularly, please.
Well, I said to the Scottish Trade Union Congress that we would hope to replicate the employment seminar, which I think carried all sectoral and all party support and was considered by all, including the STUC, a very substantial success, and apply that to a female employment summit. Because it is the case that even as unemployment in Scotland has been falling and male unemployment has been falling dramatically, female unemployment has been rising and is now marginally above male unemployment in Scotland. So I think the idea of that all-Scotland approach, applying it to finding jobs for women in the workforce, is absolutely fundamental. It's widely supported and in particular gained a warm welcome at the STUC.
Question number 5, Lewis MacDonald.
To ask the Scottish Government whether the First Minister, whether the Scottish Government will provide additional funding to community projects to reduce reoffending.
First Minister.
Well, since 2006-07, we've increased funding for community justice programmes by 22%, and that's in the face of significant cuts by the Westminster Government. We've increased funding for community justice by £2 million in cash terms between 2010-11 and 2014-15.
First Minister acknowledged the concerns of service providers like Laurie Russell of the WISE Group, who said at the weekend that the system was broken when it came to providing meaningful support for efforts to reduce reoffending. If it's broke, clearly it needs fixing. So when will his government publish the detail of their plans for resourcing such initiatives in the future?
First Minister.
Well, the development of a credible community-based approach to tackling reoffending, I think, was shown by the introduction of the community payback order in February of last year, and that will continue to be applied and further plans will be published. But I know that Lewis MacDonald would not want to give the impression that he doesn't welcome the commitment in terms of funds, which I've just indicated, against the deteriorating overall budget, that we've sustained the expenditure on vital community projects. And also, I know you won't want to give the impression that we don't have substantial success to point to in the overall crime levels. I mean, an extra 1,000 police in the streets and communities of Scotland has meant that we now have the lowest recorded level of crime in Scotland for 35 years. I would have thought that this whole chamber could issue a joint congratulations to our police service for that fantastic achievement.